We've been working on this database program. What we're trying to do today is get records to be editable inside of the database. What we have right now is we can add to this thing. So if I add Thor issue 5 volume 2, let's see, maybe comics were $2.99 back then, and this would have been 5, let's see, $19.99, I don't know. So we enter that. What we want to be able to do is select this guy out of the list and say, like, maybe we screwed up something and we want to be able to edit it. Right now that's not doing anything. Okay? So, what we want to do is inside of our comic book database, first of all, obviously we need our edit button to react to action listeners. So if you didn't already do this, you want to make sure that each of your buttons has action listener added to it. Alright, I think that that's something that you probably already did. But maybe make a note to yourself that you want to add action listener this for all of the buttons inside the constructor of the comic book database. Okay, so what we're going to do is continue this sort of theme that we've established here, where we're going to say if the source of this action event was a particular button, then go to a method with that same button name's name. So in other words, what I'm saying is we're going to go else if e.getSource equals the edit button, then go to the edit method, and then we'll create that method. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So then up here, public void edit. Okay. And then we want to make sure what we do in here is going to edit whatever is selected out of the list. Okay? So there's a way that you can figure out what is selected out of the list, and we talked about this last year, but just it's good to review it. So the index that's selected is going to come back as what type of variable? An int, right? It's going to be like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is what we expect it to be. And it turns out that if nothing is selected in the list, so if we have a list like this and there's nothing selected, then the way that we figure out that nothing is selected is by when we get the selected index, it comes back as -1, because -1 is a value that is not a valid index. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. So what we want to do is say int selected index equals, and then we want to figure that out from our comic list which index is selected. So we're going to say get selected index. And then we only want to continue doing this, this process of editing if a valid index is selected. Okay? So we want to say if selected index is greater than or equal to what value? 0. Okay. If the selected index is greater than or equal to 0, then what we want to do is we want to say, all right, well then that index represents a value inside of the array of comic books that we've created. And the array that we created was called books. Okay, so we're going to say take this thing called book, take this comic book in books at the selected index and try to edit it. Okay, and the way that we're going to do that is through using a comic book dialog. Okay, now we haven't set this up in comic book dialog yet, but that's going to be the next step that we're going to do. So we're going to write our code in here as if it is set up. So there's going to be some errors that are going to show up, and then we're going to go and set it up in the dialog, and when we set it up, it should all be ready to go. Does that make sense? Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, let's make a comic book dialog and I'll just call it CBD again for comic book dialog. And this time it's going to be a new comic book dialog. And we're going to send it two things this time. We're going to send it this database class, which is a JFrame, bless you, which is going to end up being the owner of the dialog. Okay? And the other thing that we're going to send it is the books at the selected index. Okay? Which basically means I'm going to give you a reference to the book that I want to edit. Just trying to make it so you can see this whole thing. Now, like I said, we're going to have errors in here because we don't have this constructor in comic book dialog yet. We do have a constructor in comic book dialog, the one that receives just a JFrame. Okay, so we're going to make another constructor in the dialog class that's going to say, I need a JFrame and a comic book that I'm going to edit. All right. Okay. The rest of the code for editing looks very similar to the code for adding. Okay, so we're going to go ahead down here and we're going to say, once this is all done, I should have an edited book. And I want to get that book from the dialog. Okay, you should remember from last week that the books that we get from a comic book dialog have basically two states. They're either null or they're an instance of the comic book class. Okay? So if it's null, that means that I clicked cancel. Does that make sense? If it's not null, that means I clicked either save, or if I decide to, we could change the text of that to edit. Okay? So we want to check to see what happened with this edited book. We want to check and see if it's not equal to null. Okay? If it is equal to null, we don't really want to do anything. All right? But if it isn't equal to null, that means that they click save, basically. All right? What do I want to do if they clicked save? We want to add it. We don't really want to add it, right? We're trying to do what? We're trying to replace it. Where are we trying to replace it? At the selected index. Does that make sense for everyone? So it's basically like we're saying we've taken a book out of this particular place and we've sent it to the dialog so that it can get changed. And when it comes back, we want it to go in place of the book that we took out. All right? So the way that we're going to say that is similar again to what we have up here, but just a little bit different. We're going to say, take the array of books, and at which index are we trying to go here? At selected index. Make that be equal to what? The edited book. Good. Okay. Do I want to increase book count? No. Because I haven't added a book, I've just edited a book. Does that make sense? I do want to still show, you know, the changes that I've made. Set list data to books. I shouldn't need to do this .pack, but you could, I guess. If you changed the title, then you'd want it to show up. So it's not like it's going to hurt to do this .pack. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm not doing a lot of commenting in here, but we're kind of, you know, talking about it as we go. So I'm expecting that if you need comments for yourself, that you're kind of writing your own little comments to yourself as you're taking notes. Any questions right now about the logic behind editing as far as the database goes? Okay, so the errors that we have over here, there's two errors. There's this one, and this one requires that we add another constructor to the dialog class. Okay? And then there's this one, and I just misspelled the name of that variable. So edited book with a capital B, because that's what I called it up here. Okay. So now we're going to go over to the database, I'm sorry, to the dialog class, and we're going to make that new constructor. Okay. So, like I suggested earlier, you know, you have stuff that you're doing on the database on one side of your paper, stuff that you're doing in the dialog on the other side. Okay. So, guys, what we basically want to do is this stuff again for a new constructor, but we're going to change the title text field so that we're going to set the text of that text field to have the title of the comic book. Okay? All of this depends on the fact that you hopefully have setter and getter methods inside of your like object class. So my comic book class has set title and get issue and get volume and all that stuff. Does that make sense? Okay. So in the dialog class here, there's a couple different things that we could do here, and I'm just going to show you the way that I like to do it, and you can decide what you want to do. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and take all of this stuff, okay, and put it in another method so that I can just call that method from the other constructor. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So I'm just going to call this like public void setup GUI. Okay? And then I'm going to take all of this stuff, cut it out of here, paste it in here, and then call to setup GUI. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, so all that's doing is saying, hey, go do this stuff down here. Okay. All right. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my ActionListener stuff. Okay. So I don't have to copy that code over again. So I'm going to have a method called public void add action listeners. Okay. Just copy that stuff down there and then call to that. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and paste it there. Now, if I just leave it like that, it's not permitted, right? I can't have two methods with the same name that have the same parameter set. Okay? So what I have to do down here is I have to say, oh yeah, this is the one that I wanted in order to make things editable. Okay? So what I want to do here is go ahead and say JFrame owner, and then the other thing I want to do is say comic book edit book, or call it something like that. Okay? Am I throwing too much stuff at you guys?
Yes.
Okay. So all that I've done, okay, so far is basically cleaned this constructor up so that I don't have to like copy that over again. I can just say this is your owner. I'm adding a comic book. This thing's going to be modal. Set up the GUI, add action listeners, pack the dialog. And now what I'm doing up here for the second dialog constructor is saying I'm going to have an edit book. So this is, instead of add comic book, this is going to be edit comic book. Okay? I want to set up the GUI just like I did before. Hopefully that makes sense. And then what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to put the information from this edit book into the text fields that I have. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to say, for example, title tf dot set text. Okay? And the text that I want in there comes from the edit book. So I'm going to get the text from the book Okay, get title, excuse me. And that's going to go inside the title text field. Okay, so hopefully what you notice is that as soon as I add this constructor, the errors that were in the comic book database went away. Okay, it says, oh, okay, now I know how to do this. Now I know how to make a comic book dialog that receives a book. Okay, and let's just see what this thing looks like. So if I add again Thor 3, 3, 3, 3, and I enter, I can I can select that one and I can edit it. Okay? And what it's done so far is it just set up the GUI. Okay? It went to this constructor, it set up the GUI, and the title text field's text is the edit book's title. Does that make sense so far? We want to do the same thing for the issue, the volume, the cover price, the date combo box, and the year. Does that make sense? You're looking at me like you're confused.
So it won't let you edit the other ones? Just the title.
Say it again?
So it won't let you edit the other ones, just the title
I still could edit them, but we want to make sure that we put them in the text fields. Okay? So we're going to continue with this and say issue tf.setText. Now, this one is going to require that we do a little bit of a trick here, okay? So you want to be paying attention. Because what we're going to do here is we're going to say take the edited book, or edit book, and get the issue. Well, what type does get issue return? It returns an int, okay? Can you fill a text field with an int? No. Okay? So you need to trick it a little bit and say, well, here's this empty string. So you get the string that you want because you're a text field, but also put on my issue. Okay? So that's a little trick that we've learned before. Okay? Same thing for the volume. So we're going to do that. And this time we're going to get the volume. What else do we have in here? So we got the title, issue, volume. We need the cover price. Get cover price. Okay. Setting the combo box, right, is a little bit different because if you remember when we got the down here when we get the selected index, we said we had to add one, right? So the month that we're going to use is going to come out of the the comic book, but the comic book class has an inner class called date, which kind of screws things up a little bit for us. So we're going to have to add a little bit in here in order to make that work. Okay, I will do that because I think that it just is going to prolong this thing a little bit too much, and I don't want to like add stuff that's going to be real confusing for you. So I want to just kind of leave it at this for right now and just say basically this is going to work except for the date stuff right now. Okay, so I'm going to show you that this works. Okay. So again, so we enter that. We go back to here. We select edit. Okay, comes back with all that stuff that I just entered. Okay, so let's say I screwed up the issue number and it's now 5. I screwed up the cover price. It was $1.99 back then. Okay, I can change this date, but again, I'm not really showing how that's all going to work right now. But what I do want you to notice is that when I come back to when I hit enter, this Thor number 3 should be Thor number 5 now. Okay? So I enter that, and you see that it changed to Thor number 5.
Wow.
Question?
For combo backs, if we do have text in our combo backs, we could just put set text without the columns.
Should be, yep, should be able to just do set text for that. Okay? If you guys are wondering about the date stuff, I will do that, but I'm going to stop the recording. And then do it after that, because it's just gonna it's not really that complicated, but it's gonna elongate this thing a little bit too much. So again, what we did, gentlemen back there, what we did is we made a copy of this, and we moved some stuff out of here so that it makes it a little more straightforward, I think, using methods here. So comic book dialog constructor sets up the, creates the, does the super call, sets up the GUI, add action listeners to all the stuff, and then packs. The only difference for this one is that we're trying to edit, so I changed this to edit, set up the GUI, fill the text fields and eventually the combo box, add action listeners. The one thing that you could do, if you're interested in this, is you could change the title of, or change the text of the save button. Okay? So saveb.setText to be edit instead of save. Okay? Did I not call it save B? I called it enter B. Okay? And the last thing that I think that you would do is over in the database, okay? Over in the database, maybe put in an error message if the selected index is not greater than or equal to 0. Okay? To tell them, in order to edit, you have to select something. Does that make sense? Okay? So you could put an else in there and just use a J option pane. Okay, and what that does over here again is makes it so that when I click the edit button, now again there's nothing to select here, but when I click the edit button, it's going to say please select a book to edit if there's nothing selected. Okay?